From the 2016 Ohioana Book Festival, this is Craft. My name is Doug Dangler, and I am here today with Jill Bialosky, who is a poet, an author, a novelist, and a book editor. So welcome to Craft, Jill Bialosky.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So tell me about your latest book, which is, I believe, called The Players, and it's has sort of a baseball theme and a poetry theme.
Right. Yes, it's a collection of poetry called The Players, and I have a long poem in 14 sections that opens the book called Manhood, where I use the baseball field as a sort of setting to talk about the American family and American communities.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, I had a young son who played baseball, so I was a baseball mom.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on the baseball field a lot, and as my son became more competitive and as he joined tournament teams, the stakes became much higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very interested in exploring issues of gender through this baseball lens. So for instance, I have poems from the point of view of the fathers, who would be the spectators, the coaches, the mothers, who are the caretakers, and of course the players.
Mm-hmm. So now, baseball games are long.
Yes, they are.
Did you write during the baseball games?
No, I was really very much a spectator and observer of the game, but I did occasionally, once I started thinking about actually writing a piece about this, I did take some notes.
Okay.
Yes.
What kind of things did you note during the baseball game? What made it into
first of all, I just loved, the opening poem is called Chatter. And so I just really loved the chatter that goes on a baseball field, from the listening to how the coaches talk to the boys, how the boys talk to each other, how the fathers congregate in one group, very competitively, watching their sons, and the mothers sort of drinking coffee and praying that their son will get a hit so that they'll be happy that night. So
there's competition with the fathers and prayers from the mothers.
Right,
That's
exactly,
okay.
Yes, and also I have a poem called The Girls, which is about the teenage girls that sit on the bleachers to watch their boyfriends.
Oh, okay.
So that was an
So what are they
interesting
doing?
poem. So they tend to be very quiet.
Really?
Yeah, absorbing what's going on in the game, and it's just
Now, wait,
interesting interaction between how the players, look occasionally up at the girls that are watching.
I see. So they're absorbing the action, not bored.
That's a good question.
So I'm not a baseball fan.
No, I remember when I was actually in high school and I had a boyfriend that played softball, and I would go to his games and bring a book.
Okay.
So yes, I would imagine.
You didn't do that with your children?
No, with my son, it was very, I actually came to really appreciate baseball through his lens of the skill and concentration involved in that game is really quite something. And in fact, it's kind of very much like poetry in the sense that it takes such skill, concentration, commitment. So I really came to appreciate the game.
Right. Years ago, I went to a rodeo in the West, and I remember the rodeo announcer kept saying, "That cowboy is poetry in motion."
Yes.
So perhaps it's the same thing, that baseball player is poetry in motion. I'm not familiar with the ways that people are described on the field, but you've written about them, so they are sort of in your poems, poetry in motion. What are some of the things that people, like if your son has read it, remarked on after he was done reading it and saying, here's an aspect of baseball that you picked up on I hadn't thought of, or things that he thought you might write about that didn't?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. I was nervous about how he would react to my writing about this topic, and what I did was, the poem is written in the we voice, so I'm kind of it's a chorus, So I felt as if I wasn't really infringing on his personal experience, that I was trying to write a collective voice. But I knew that he was very pleased with the book, because when I told him that I dedicated it to him and I used his initials, he said, "Mom, why didn't you use my first full name?"
Ah, okay.
So I know that he was very proud.
So the second and third editions will feature
yes,
his full name.
I should do that.
Right.
But I have read the baseball poem at readings and events, and the response is really so positive, because I think many people share this experience of either once having been on a team. It doesn't have to be baseball, it can be football, it can be soccer, it can be girls swimming, but just the way in which a community rallies around an event and the different relationships. So it tends to get a great response.
Okay. So how do you regard, say, poetry since you started writing and to now? Is it a genre that's expanding? Is it contracting? What's going on in poetry for you?
Well, you know, one of the missions that I feel as a poet is to try to educate people that poetry is really so much about everyday life. I mean, most poets write about love, death, loss, grief. And these are the cornerstones of our of reality as human beings. So I think that poetry often gets a bad rap, that people find it, that they can't understand it. But if you spend, I think, some time with poetry, I think people generally are surprised that they can relate to poetry. That I'm talking about lyric poetry that is really about very human experiences.
Okay. Have you gotten you said your son read the book. Have you gotten them into poetry? Have you been able to say?
Well, when he was younger, I would read him some of the poetry that I really love and admire. And Robert Frost is a big hero of mine, and his poems are very accessible. And my son wrote some poetry when he was younger. Now he's off doing other things. He's in college now, but I think he has come to appreciate it as an art form.
So you've also written novels.
Yes.
You've got the prize.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Yes. So the prize is my new novel, and it is set in New York City in the art world, and my protagonist is a gallery owner. And it's about his relationship with one of his artists who he makes quite famous, and then she turns on him. Okay. And so I was interested in exploring the ideas of the marriage between art and commerce. So what happens when somebody who has been painting in isolation for a number of years and gets discovered, you know, how does that change her relationship to herself? Okay. And so it was a fun theme to explore, because it's also very much about the other, I think that the issues that I raise in the novel are issues that take place in other fields, you know, in literature and music and even in, you know, business realms. Okay. But the novel is also about marriage and about love and betrayal, so it's not just about artists.
Okay. Now, you live in New York City.
I do.
So did this require a lot of going to galleries or getting to know artists in new ways, making them take you to dinner?
Right.
You know, how does that work?
Right. No, that's a great question. And I love to go to art galleries and to museums, so I've done that all my life. But when I came up with the idea for this novel, I did go to galleries. I went to some of the art shows, like the Armory show. I also had the wonderful experience of visiting artist studios and listening to them talk about their art. And I have friends who are artists, so I did a lot of research for the novel. Okay.
Now, I'm curious about there's a distinction, right, between an artist and a writer. Do you notice a big difference in those sorts of people? Because you've got, you know, painter friends, and it's much more obvious when they're working, right? Because they're covered in paint or whatever. A writer's working, the writer's just alone. right? And you can
Yes.
answer the door and be fine. But if you're an artist, you don't answer the door because you're covered in paint.
Right.
So there's these really significant sort of physical differences for
Mm-hmm.
them. Do you notice a difference in sort of their personalities or their approach to work because of things like that?
Right. No, that's. Well, I have been to art, as I said, to some studios, and what I have noticed is that the work seems so much more physical than writing. Whether they're sculptors or painters, there's a real physical sense. And I think that writers tend to be more cerebral in their approach to their art. From a distance, it seems really fun to be a painter. Looking at it
From a distance,
right.
right.
But I would imagine that painters might say that about writers.
You don't get a lot of people jealous of somebody sitting in a chair for 4 or 5 hours at a time. That may be a little unusual.
Yeah.
But putting paint down or sculpting does seem like it's more like there's a tactile enjoyment that you might get out of it that's lacking in writing.
Still, I think that both artists and writers really do live in solitude, that their work sort of comes from a place from within, and then they have to contextualize it. So that I do think that it also is sort of unless an artist is working on big installations with other people, my guess is that it is a pretty solitary.
Okay. And speaking of working, with other people, you're an editor at W.W. Norton. What sort of advice do you give to if you work with fiction authors or poets or whatever the branch that you're working on? What kind of advice do you give to help them become better as writers?
Well, usually the writers that I work with are very talented and really at a high level. And I work with novelists and with poets, and also I edit some nonfiction. So in some ways, how I see myself as an editor is really somebody who is their first reader. So when I get a manuscript from a writer, my job is to translate, to communicate what I'm reading on the page. And so it's an interesting dialogue, and it begins that way.
What are some of the most common things that you say to authors after you get a manuscript?
Right. Well, of course, you always want to offer praise first. So it's usually I reflect upon what I think is the strength of the work, and then if we're having an editorial conversation, then I would go into certain areas that I think might need more work or more explanation or more cutting. So we talk about those kinds of issues. But with every book, it's really different.
All right. Well, Jill Bialosky, thank you very much for talking to me today. And again, your books are one we didn't get to talk about, but I encourage people to look at A History of a Suicide and The Players and the Prize. So thank you very much, and enjoy Ohioana.
Yeah, thank you so much.
For more information from my guests, visit www.crafttheshow.com. This is Doug Dangler. Until next time, be creative.